The call came in at 7:15 on a Thursday, a number I didn't recognize with a Michigan area code, and the man on the line introduced himself as Gary Marsh from Marsh Vintage Watercraft before asking, with a caution in his voice that told me something was wrong before he even finished the sentence, whether I still owned a 1961 Chris Craft Sportsman that had apparently been sold to his lot 9 days earlier for $6,000. I told him that boat hadn't left my boathouse in 4 years, that it wasn't for sale and never had been, and Gary Marsh went quiet for a long moment before saying, "Sir, I think you'd better come down here, because something about this sale has had my stomach in knots since the day it happened, and now I understand why. My name is Thomas Reyes, I'm 66 years old, and that boat had belonged to my late wife Margaret more completely than nearly anything else she'd ever owned in her life, a wooden runabout she'd bought as a wreck at an estate auction 17 years ago and spent 4 painstaking years restoring in our garage, teaching herself marine woodworking from a stack of borrowed library books and countless weekend visits to old boat builders willing to share what they knew with a woman most of them initially assumed was simply buying a gift for her husband rather than doing the work herself. She used to laugh about that assumption, telling me she almost enjoyed correcting it every single time, watching some grizzled boat builder's face shift from polite condescension to genuine respect once he realized she actually understood what she was asking about. Margaret died 5 years ago from a stroke that gave us no warning at all, and in the years since, that boat had become the single object in our house I found myself unable to look at directly some mornings, not because I loved boating, which I never particularly did, but because every inch of restored mahogany carried some specific memory of watching my wife spend entire Saturdays hunched over that hull with a level of focus I rarely saw her bring to anything else in her life. Our son Ethan is 24 years old, and our relationship since Margaret's death has carried a particular strain I've struggled for years to properly name, Ethan's grief expressing itself less as sadness and more as a restless, anxious need to prove himself to people whose approval, I've come to believe, mattered to him far more than it should have. A pattern that intensified considerably once he started dating a woman named Sabrina 18 months ago, a relationship built, as far as I could ever tell, largely around a specific lifestyle Sabrina expected rather than anything especially grounded between the two of them. I'd tried, more than once over the years, to gently suggest he talk to someone about his mother's death, and he'd always deflected with the same easy dismissiveness, telling me he was handling it fine, that he just processed grief differently than I did, and I'd let each of those conversations drop, telling myself I was respecting his boundaries rather than avoiding a subject I wasn't entirely sure I knew how to navigate myself. Ethan had moved back in with me 7 months earlier, ostensibly to save money while switching careers from marketing into something in tech he kept describing in terms too vague for me to ever fully understand, and I'd welcomed the arrangement, hoping, perhaps naively, that time together might finally give us space to talk honestly about a grief neither of us had properly processed since Margaret's funeral. What I hadn't anticipated was that Ethan had apparently decided, sometime in those 7 months, that his mother's boat represented an untapped resource rather than a memorial worth protecting, and that Sabrina's persistent talk about a friend's upcoming wedding in Paris, an event Ethan clearly couldn't afford to attend given his current employment situation, mattered enough to him that liquidating his mother's restored boat seemed, in whatever calculation led him there, like a reasonable solution to a problem entirely of his own making. Gary Marsh explained, once I'd driven the 90 minutes to his lot the following morning, exactly how the transaction had unfolded. A young man matching Ethan's description had brought the boat in on a borrowed trailer 9 days earlier, accompanied by a bill of sale carrying my signature and a photocopy of what appeared to be my driver's license, explaining that his father had recently moved into a retirement community and could no longer keep up a boat he barely used anymore, a story specific enough that Gary had no immediate reason to doubt it. What had continued bothering him afterward, he told me, wasn't the story itself but the price, $6,000 for a boat that any serious vintage dealer would recognize, once properly inspected, as worth considerably more, likely somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000 given the quality of the restoration and the increasing rarity of a sportsman in that particular condition. Nobody selling on behalf of an elderly father downsizing prices something at 1/10 of its actual worth, Gary told me, standing beside the boat in his lot, the two of us watching a light rain start against the corrugated roof overhead, unless they either genuinely have no idea what they're holding, or they're in a considerable hurry and don't much care what it sells for as long as the cash lands quickly. He'd held off listing it for resale specifically because the discrepancy had continued nagging at him, enough that he'd eventually called the number listed on the boat's original registration paperwork rather than relying solely on the number the young man had provided, a small act of due diligence that led directly to my Thursday evening phone call. I want to describe what settled over me standing in that lot, one hand resting against the hull my wife had sanded smooth with her own patient hands, the rain picking up steadily around us both, because it wasn't simply anger, though anger arrived eventually and lingered longer than I'm entirely proud of. It was something closer to a specific, disorienting grief, understanding that my son had looked at the most tangible remaining piece of his mother's careful labor and seen, instead of something worth protecting, an obstacle standing between himself and a wedding trip meant to impress a girlfriend who had, as far as I knew, never once expressed any real curiosity about Margaret's memory or Ethan's actual financial circumstances. I drove home that afternoon, the boat still safely held at Gary's lot pending what he delicately called a resolution between family members, and found Ethan in the kitchen, apparently unaware I'd received any call at all, scrolling through his phone with a casualness that made it genuinely difficult not to simply erupt the moment I walked through the door. Instead, I asked him plainly whether he knew anything about his mother's boat no longer being in the boathouse, and I watched every muscle in his face attempt and fail to construct a plausible lie before he finally set his phone face down on the counter and admitted, quietly, that yes, he'd sold it. The explanation that followed unfolded over nearly 2 hours at that kitchen table, Ethan's justifications shifting several times as each one failed to hold up under the weight of what he'd actually done. He told me first that he'd planned to tell me eventually, once the trip felt more finalized, a claim that grew considerably harder to sustain once I pointed out that forging my signature and photocopying my license without my knowledge suggested a plan built specifically around never having that conversation at all. He told me, then, that he'd assumed I wouldn't mind, that the boat was, basically just sitting there, a framing that revealed, more clearly than almost anything else he said that afternoon, exactly how little he'd understood, or perhaps had understood perfectly well and simply decided mattered less than his own immediate wants, about what that boat actually represented to me. It was only later in that conversation, once his composure had fully cracked, that Ethan finally told me something closer to the truth underneath all of it, that Sabrina had made attending this particular wedding a kind of unspoken test of the relationship, that she'd hinted more than once that his inability to keep pace with her social circle financially was becoming a real problem for her, and that some desperate, cornered part of him had looked at his mother's boat sitting quietly in the boathouse and decided, in a moment of panic he now clearly regretted, that it represented the fastest available solution to a problem he'd convinced himself, briefly, was worth solving at any cost. I told Ethan plainly that any relationship requiring him to forge his father's signature and liquidate his dead mother's most treasured possession to sustain itself was not a relationship worth protecting in the first place, and that I intended to file a police report regarding the forgery, not necessarily to pursue criminal charges against my own son, a decision I genuinely hadn't made in that moment, but because Gary Marsh's lot needed documented proof the transaction had been fraudulent in order to legally return the boat to me, documentation that required an official report regardless of what I ultimately decided about prosecution. Ethan's face, hearing that, moved through something I still think about, fear certainly, but underneath it, something that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of someone who's been carrying an unsustainable lie and finally has the choice about continuing it taken entirely out of his hands. He didn't fight me on the report. He sat there, quiet, and told me, in what I believe was the first genuinely honest thing he'd said in that entire conversation, that some part of him had wanted to get caught, that he'd barely slept during those 9 days waiting for either the trip to actually happen or the whole plan to collapse, and that some exhausted corner of him was almost grateful the collapse had arrived first. I recovered the boat 3 weeks later, once the paperwork with Gary's lot and the local police department had properly sorted itself out, Ethan's forgery documented but no formal charges pursued at my request, a decision made not out of forgiveness exactly but out of an unwillingness to let this single failure permanently define whatever relationship remained possible between my son and me. Ethan and Sabrina ended things within a month, a development that surprised no one who'd watched the relationship's final stretch unfold from any real distance, and Ethan moved into a small apartment with a former college roommate shortly after, taking a steady if unglamorous position doing IT support and, for the first time in longer than I can easily remember, actually saving money rather than spending whatever came into his hands as quickly as it arrived. The boat sits back in my boathouse now, and some Saturday afternoons I go out there myself, not to work on it the way Margaret once did, since I never learned even a fraction of what she knew about wood and finish, but simply to sit beside it, running my hand along the mahogany she spent 4 years bringing carefully back to life, and I think, more often than I probably should, about how close I came to losing the last tangible piece of her patient love for something worth restoring, sold for a fraction of its worth by a son who, I have to believe, was drowning in a grief neither of us ever properly learned how to name out loud, and who mistook his mother's memory for an obstacle standing between himself and a life he was never actually built to want in the first place. Ethan and I speak more often now than we did during those 7 months he lived under my roof, still carrying whatever unspoken grief eventually led him to Gary Marsh's lot, brief calls mostly, sometimes about nothing more significant than his new job or a movie he'd seen, but real in a way our conversations rarely managed to be before. He asked me a few weeks ago, somewhat hesitantly, whether he could come by on a weekend and see the boat, not to touch it or help with anything, simply to sit near it the way I do, and I told him of course, that it had always been as much his inheritance from his mother as it was mine to protect, a truth I probably should have said aloud to him years earlier instead of quietly assuming he already understood it without ever hearing the words. He hasn't come by yet, but I believe he will eventually, in his own time, the way most real repairs happen slowly rather than all at once, and I've decided that's a kind of patience worth extending him now, the same patience his mother always seemed to have in endless supply for anything worth eventually making whole again.